Chronic traumatic encephalopathy is my topic I chose. And just to reiterate, this is not just a football phenomenon. It also is happening to other people in other arenas outside of just football. Traumatic encephaly can be defined as a neuropathological defined disease and is reportedly linked to a history of repeated brain trauma. Is that over a decade ago, the first published case of CTE happened in American football, and it marked the beginning of where people really started to pay attention and became aware of this problem. In the 1920s, though, is when the first medical literature was known for CTE, and back then it was known as the punch drunk syndrome, which makes a lot of sense because initially, if you watch boxing, when you hit someone really hard in the head, they usually get dazed and kind of like lose their positioning in the ring, and you'll kind of see them like stumbling around the ring, oftentimes unable to get their composure and be able to focus on their opponent. They later renamed this disease in 1928 as dementia pugilistica, which also makes sense because dementia means a loss of memory, and if you get hit probably enough times in the brain, your short-term, long-term memory is probably going to get damaged. These terms describe a syndrome that affects boxers' motor, behavioral, and cognitive skills, and they were, as I said earlier, a result of constant blows to the head. Ongoing as to what causes CTE. The diagnosis can only be made in this day and time after someone has initially died from the disease. So what they do is generally they are taking someone's brain essentially and cutting it open and searching for this specific neuron called tau. And this neuron in people with CTE is generally accumulated in the frontal lobe of the brain, and that causes disturbance to other neurons, which causes the brain to not be able to think or act or function in a way that's proper, because your brains are not firing, your brain neurons are not firing correctly. Signs and symptoms is memory. Again, getting hit in the head or having a traumatic brain injury will affect your memory. It in general will cause you maybe to have some speech issues and not be able to think clearly and able to execute your day-to-day functions, which is your executive dysfunction. Your mood probably would change. You can go from having moods of depression, feeling sad, apathy, and also feeling suicidal. Your behavior changes can include some forms of aggression, increased violent tendencies, and disinhibition. And if you keep up with the news and follow the Aaron Hernandez case, who was a former player of the New England Patriots, I think that he essentially was convicted of murder, and this was a man who was a star player on the team and had his whole life to look forward to, who was out here killing people for, I don't know, for pleasure, for a rush, but killing people. And as a result of him being convicted of murder, he later went on to commit suicide while he was in jail. Again, this disease affects football players because, as you can see in this photo, their head-to-head contact, even though the helmets are on, you're still physically getting hit in the head, which your brain is not meant to constantly receive punches to the head. And veterans, they have experienced some traumatic brain injury due to the fact that explosions can sometimes be too close to the ear and can cause your brain to misfire hearing loss from repetitive battle sounds. Muhammad Ali was also a prize fighter who later on went on to suffer from Parkinson's disease, and he possibly could have suffered from CTE from his boxing days. And women in sports are not talked about as much, but because they are in a lot of contact sports, it can make sense that they as well could suffer from this syndrome. So I have talked exclusively about the sports and how football is like the big topic nowadays, that many of the players are now experiencing effects of their latter years of being in the league. And it's not only that concussions that can cause this, it can also be other injuries to the brain that can cause the CTE. It's also soldiers, boxers can also experience this, but we are talking about all of these injuries, and as well as soldiers, and predominantly we are talking about males who are more or less the topic when it comes to talking about CTEs. Women are rarely discussed. I have found little discussion on how in depth any study has been done on women who suffer from CTEs, and because they're not publicized a lot in the news, then women probably are getting overlooked for this disease. Does race affect who gets CTE? Indirectly, I would say that we can conclude that since most of the athletes who play football, I'm almost willing to think that about 97% of them are Black. So a lot of our men who are getting affected would be of the Black race, but I think that any professional football player, Black or white, could suffer from this disease. It just happens that most Black men are the ones who are in the positions of where they are tackling or defensive players or running backs and constantly getting pushed to the ground or getting hit in the head. And because we're talking about sports, many of these Black men have used this sport to come out of their socioeconomic backgrounds to further themselves in life. And football was, again, their way of changing their circumstances. And as a result, educational level, if they went to college, maybe played a factor, as well as many of them may have left school early to try and reach their big dream of making it to the NBA, or boxing as well to get to improve their financial statuses. Two videos that further talk about CTE and the research being done today, and how researchers are working extensively to try to diagnose CTE before it ultimately leads to death.